Hi everyone, and welcome to The Truth About Psychiatry. This is episode 16, and I would like to call this video, um, The Sickness of Psychiatry, or Psychiatry is Sick. And in this episode, I've been thinking about the possible reactions to my videos or questions, concerns that people might have. And I just want to show the other side of this question and to debunk the myths on the other side, which is to say that obviously there are a lot of people who are pro-psychiatry. There are a lot of people who have written in favor of psychiatry, and there are obviously many people who believe in the myths of mental illness, the chemical imbalance hoax, and all of the other myriad deceptions of psychiatry. So there are several books that I've read. One is a History of Psychiatry, written by a man named Edward Shorter, which I've mentioned in some previous videos. I'd like to review that book. There's also a great series of books called A Very Short Introduction, and if you've ever read any of those, they have excellent summaries of a wide variety of topics. Just so happens that they have a book on psychiatry by a man named Tom Burns, and I'd like to analyze that book. There's another book by a man named E. Fuller Torrey, who is one of the major defenders or promoters of psychiatry in the United States. And he wrote a book called American Psychosis that I will also review. So those are the main books on the pro-psychiatry side that I'd like to review to give you a picture of what some people on the pro-psychiatry side are saying and why I think they're just plain wrong. And then I also came across a few other books that I may bring up towards the end, just as other examples of authors, psychiatrists who are promoting psychiatry. And I did come across this, Mrs. Frisbee and the Rats of Nim. So I haven't read it yet, but I remember fondly the cartoon from when I was younger. So I'd be interested to read it though, and to see. I bet it has some interesting ideas that are applicable to psychiatry. So let's just jump right into A History of Psychiatry by Edward Shorter. The subtitle is From the Era of the Asylum to the Age of Prozac. So this is ostensibly a history from the early days of modern psychiatry up until just recently. Well, now it's been probably several decades since Prozac was popularized. So this is my review of Edward Shorter's History of Psychiatry. It is not surprising that Edward Shorter's The History of Psychiatry has become the standard text in the field. It has attained this high status or low status, depending on one's perspective, because Shorter deftly manipulates historical events in order to defend psychiatry itself. That psychiatry should require a defense at all raises suspicion about the profession. But Shorter's work provides more than ample fodder for a wholesale repudiation of the discipline. Shorter begins with his Parvulum opus with the feeble presupposition that psychiatry represents a legitimate answer to the question of mental and emotional suffering, and that this answer arises from a supposedly firm understanding of the underlying causes of such suffering. Quote, yet mental disorder as such has always been familiar, Shorter proclaims, in The Birth of Psychiatry, the opening chapter of his book. Quote, having a partly biological and genetic basis, psychiatric illness is as old as the human condition. Although not all mental disturbances are buried in the integuments of our nervous system, some certainly are, arising from disorders of the chemistry of the brain itself. It follows then that human society has always known psychiatric illness and has always had ways of coping with it. Unquote. To begin and base an entire book on such a daft proposal would be amusing if it weren't so harmful. If anything, history has repeatedly proven that the hunt for biological and genetic causes of so-called psychiatric illnesses has been no more fruitful than snipe hunting or the search for Sasquatch and leprechauns. So this this claim it's often made in psychiatry that so-called psychiatric illnesses, first of all, that they come from a chemical imbalance in the brain, which we've shown is simply false, and also that they are that's old as a human condition. First of all, he's writing a history of modern psychiatry, and the notion that these so-called mental disorders are as old as history is nonsense, because most of them were invented relatively recently. Also, that there is a biological or genetic base to these fictitious diseases is obviously completely false. First, because there's no such thing as mental illness. Second, even if there were, there's absolutely no proof that there is any biological or genetic basis. Although, obviously, psychiatrists, psychiatry, and propagandists for psychiatry or apologists for psychiatry will often make these sort of claims. However, Shorter's research is not without merit. The historical weapons that he feverishly brandishes in defense of psychiatry could just as easily be wielded against it. In other words, when viewed from the perspective of patients rather than psychiatrists, even Shorter's history offers a strong condemnation rather than a defense of psychiatry. In the early stages of the book, Shorter posits a deceptive dichotomy between biological, neuroscientific understanding of psychiatry on the one hand and a Freudian psychosocial understanding of psychiatry on the other. Shorter attempts to persuade his audience that modern psychiatry represents the triumph of the former over the latter, but he never pauses to consider the fact that both strands of psychiatry originate from the same erroneous source. This is another common claim in psychiatry, is that there is the Freudian psychoanalytics and psychotherapy side and the biological side, and that modern psychiatry has been advancing, and part of their advancement shows that they're able to diagnose more accurately these biological mental illnesses, which is absolutely false. And yet here it is in one of the standard textbooks for psychiatry, or the history of psychiatry, or at least it was. I don't know what it is now, how many people actually read this book, but if they do, it's important to know what the true history of psychiatry actually is. One need look no further than the origin of the word psychiatry itself, a word coined in 1808 by the German physician Johann Christian Reil, meaning medical treatment of the soul. Think about it. The entire enterprise of psychiatry rests upon the definition of a psyche, or a soul. Until a psychiatrist can accurately define and account for what a soul actually is, he or she has absolutely no business in applying any sort of medical treatment thereto, even if such a thing were possible. If Shorter's perception of psychiatry as a biological and neuroscientific practice were precise, it might more properly be called something like somiatry, that is, the medical treatment of the body. But then what would distinguish it from plain old medicine? The psyche in ancient Greece meant life in the sense of breath or spirit. One can no more genuinely apply medical treatment to life, breath, or the spirit then one can pin Casper the Friendly Ghost to a wall. Furthermore, both the Freudian psychosocial framework for psychiatry and the biological neuroscientific framework that Shorter and many others have envisaged stand in direct opposition to most traditional concepts of the soul, including the Greek psyche and especially the Christian anima. Freud regarded the monotheistic God as an illusion, and the modern relativistic scientism, of which psychiatry is only a small branch, is the ideological descendant of Cartesian dualism and Nietzschean deicide. Therefore, it could rightly be inferred that psychiatry is, and always has been, the antithesis of both religion and the soul. To be more specific, psychiatry claims to advance the compassionate treatment of the soul while medicalizing and pathologizing the soul into oblivion. Shorter elaborates upon his misleading depiction of the dichotomies in psychiatry by tracing their respective developments through the era of the asylum to modern times. Although many of his accounts are historically accurate, Shorter demonstrates an appalling lack of consideration for the suffering inflicted by the barbaric psychiatric practices. He fully endorses methods that have long since been proven harmful, such as electroshock and insulin shock treatment. He even writes approvingly of the pharmaceutical revolution in psychiatry, or the so-called revolution, that introduced brain-disabling drugs into the market, from metrazole and thorazine to Miltown, Librium, Valium, and Prozac. As a historian writing to defend psychiatry, Shorter has painstakingly collected enough evidence in A History of Psychiatry to effectively debunk his own thesis. Although Shorter demonstrates an astounding deficiency in moral reasoning, one can at least be thankful for his efforts in compiling a history of the atrocities that have been perpetrated in the name of psychiatry. So I find Shorter's work helpful because even though he's trying to write an apologetic work for psychiatry, he's trying to promote it and defend it, the actual record, much of which he includes, although not all of it, shows exactly the opposite. So many of the things that Shorter records in his history are also recorded in Mad in America, Anatomy of an Epidemic, Bonnie Burstow's work, the work of Thomas Szasz. But Shorter tries to put a positive spin on all of these horrendous and barbaric so-called treatments. He tries to write from the perspective of the psychiatrist, which naturally will lean towards promoting and defending psychiatry as if it were an actual medical profession and not the pseudoscientific system of slavery that masquerades as a medical profession. So that's a little introduction to Edward Shorter's A History of Psychiatry from the era of the asylum to the age of Prozac. So this other book, another apologetic work, is Tom Burns' Psychiatry, A Very Short Introduction. So I really like these very short introductions. I've read several of them, and they're normally very helpful, but unsurprisingly, this particular book shows, just like Edward Shorter's book, that it shows a surprising lack of understanding or of what psychiatry actually is. But in a way, it's not surprising because, of course, that's what a psychiatrist would do, was try to defend his own supposed profession. Psychiatry, A Very Short Introduction, is a conflicted, contradictory little book. In a word, it is a very short introduction. In a word, and in a very short introduction to this very short introduction, psychiatry itself is sick. Nevertheless, whether intentionally or not, Tom Burns, who is also the author of Our Necessary Shadow, The Nature and Meaning of Psychiatry, has done an excellent job of describing many of the symptoms of psychiatry's sickness. Initially, Burns sets out to defend and promote psychiatry in spite of its horrific track record. To be fair, the author acknowledges some of the problems associated with psychiatry, but in a paradoxical twist of the imagination, he attempts to demonstrate that such problems make psychiatry an exciting field of endeavor. In the preface to his booklet, Burns writes, quote, "I am often asked, only half joking, whether we become psychiatrists because we are odd, or did we become odd as a result of being psychiatrists? The New Yorker magazine produces compilations of its cartoons, and there are invariably so many about psychiatrists that they regularly warrant their own volume." So this is a almost shocking lack of self-awareness uh, to notice that, you know, it's even there in the term shrinks, where, you know, psychiatrists try to laugh this off and all these cartoons and things as if there weren't some truth behind it. So in answer to his question, whether they're odd or did they become odd as a result of being psychiatrists, I would say there's probably a little bit of both, because psychiatry has a corrupting influence on those who are um, who go into that profession. I would say, but I would emphasize what Robert Whitaker has also emphasized, that it's more like a rotten barrel, and even good apples can be in this rotten barrel. But it's sad that the good apples don't recognize the rotten barrel that they're in, or they try to beautify what Thomas Saw's called prettifying plantations. You know, trying to, you know, more crass term, polish a turd. And I've talked about that, how it's even worse than that, because as I've mentioned before, at least dung or excrement has a value in fertilizer. Psychiatry can also inspire fear, Burns continues in his preface. It is, after all, the only branch of medicine which can force treatment on individuals. Let's think about that for a second. This is a so-called medical profession, and even Burns himself admits that it can force treatment on individuals. Is that where in anything? I've talked about the art of healing before, medicine meaning to make things grow, to flourish. Where in that definition would any of this fit into medicine? This statement is then followed by a series of appalling lies and cunning half-truths. For example, Burns asserts, quote, "Chapters 5 and 6 deal with the controversies that have raged around and within psychiatry ever since it first emerged as a profession. It is a fair criticism of this book that it devotes more space to these than to the undeniable advances. I could have dwelt more on psychiatry's advances in new drugs, psychological treatments, and working practices which have made an enormous contribution to human welfare. I do not want to suggest any skepticism about the progress that psychiatry has made and is making. Psychiatry and the neurosciences are making remarkable strides." Unquote. Burns' booklet lists some of the, quote, "controversies that have raged around and within psychiatry, but the claim that psychiatry has made great advances and enormous contributions to human welfare is patently false. Burns' relative reticence concerning psychiatry's undeniable advances and its prolixity concerning the controversies underscores the dark reality that psychiatry has something to hide. So welcome, Burns boasts, to an area of medicine that is both mysterious and exciting, as advances in brain sciences continually bump up against the messy reality of human beings. So it's just a silly, nonsensical way of trying to promote psychiatry by making it sound exciting, as if forcing horrible abuse on human beings is exciting. So the real messy reality that is hidden behind every word of Psychiatry, a very short introduction, a reality which Burns never fully engages, is that millions upon millions of innocent people, including his own dear mother, have been harmed and are currently being harmed by pernicious practices in psychiatry. If psychiatric abuses weren't so ubiquitously tragic, Burns' attempt to define psychiatry in the opening chapter of his booklet would simply be comical. As a professor of social psychiatry at the University of Oxford and a practicing consultant psychiatrist in the NHS, Burns is ostensibly an expert in psychiatry. Yet when it comes to defining his own profession, he fumbles through manifold meaningless metaphors and a very loose definition of the word psyche. Burns begins by describing what psychiatry is not. It is not psychology, psychoanalysis, or psychotherapy. Psychiatry, he writes, is a branch of medicine which deals with mental illnesses, nowadays often called psychiatric disorders. Burns further complicates his definition of psychiatry by revealing his own struggle to define mental illness. Quote, "There is a marked circularity about this. A psychiatrist is someone who diagnoses and treats psychiatric disorders. Psychiatric disorders are those conditions which are diagnosed and treated by psychiatrists. There has been endless controversy about the reliability of psychiatric diagnoses and even whether or not mental illness exists at all. It is worth spending a little time on why," and I'm still quoting Burns, "it is worth spending a little time on why psychiatric diagnoses are so controversial, both because it keeps cropping up and also because the same issues are fundamental to all medicine, though rarely as striking." Unquote. Burns admits that the subjectivity of the diagnostic process is more than just a little perplexing. Quote, "Diagnoses based on a patient's mental state contain no concrete evidence for the diagnosis. There are no blood tests or X-ray pictures. Psychiatric diagnoses rely on making a judgment about why someone is doing something, not just the observation of what they are doing." Although Burns appears to acknowledge such perplexities, he promptly explains them away with absurd justifications. Quote, "So psychiatry is not for the faint-hearted or those who need too much intellectual security." Unquote. "One thing is certain, psychiatry is not for the faint-hearted because those who have been valiant and fortunate enough to endure psychiatric abuses are anything but faint of heart, and only those who oppose such psychiatric abuses have any claim to intellectual security." With an uncritical audacity that is common in the field, Burns expounds upon the nature and scope of psychiatry. He then delves into the history of psychiatry, all the while making preposterous claims about the effectiveness of that which is euphemistically called psychiatric treatment. For example, Burns maintains that a range of drugs have been proven effective in settling patients because they calm the mind. One might argue that illegal drugs and alcohol calm the minds of drug addicts and alcoholics, but no one dare allege that such substances are good for those who ingest or imbibe them. Burns traces the origins of psychiatry to Germany and a few founding fathers, Geisinger, Morel, Alzheimer, Kraepelin, Bleuler, Freud, and Jung. He describes the first medical model of psychiatry, electroconvulsive therapy, mental health legislation, the transition of psychiatry from the asylum to the community, and the advent of psychoanalysis and psychotherapy. It is worth noting that Burns almost blindly identifies one of the core problems with psychiatry in his description of psychiatry's most notorious and ignominious founding fathers. Quote, "Freud's thinking was heavily influenced by the scientific models that surrounded him. Darwin's Origin of Species had located mankind squarely in the natural world, not a special divine creation. So the mind became a legitimate subject for scientific investigation. This shift in the commonly accepted understanding of human nature produced catastrophic consequences, not the least of which was the psychiatric dehumanization of suffering." So we've talked about a lot about that in previous videos about the distinction between mind and brain and why it's problematic to attempt to apply material medicine to the mind or psyche, as if the mind or the soul were just another biological or measurable object, or as if as if the soul could be reduced to uh, scientific, or in the case of psychiatry, pseudoscientific scrutiny. Not until chapters 5 and 6 of his booklet does Burns begin to address the real problems inherent in psychiatry. Quote, psychiatry has always been controversial, Burns remarks. There never was an extended golden age of peace and tranquility when everyone was in agreement, because it deals with the mind and because psychiatrists can act against our wishes, which will always generate a degree of suspicion and fear. Again, just an appalling lack of self-awareness that, of course, there was never an extended golden age because it's been corrupt since inception, and also the claim that psychiatry deals with the mind is just plain nonsense. Psychiatry is, I mean, as we've already shown in previous videos, how would, and even how would acting against the patient's wishes, or which is a euphemism for violating their freedoms, or violating their agency, how would that in any way have anything to do with treating the mind or applying medical treatment to the mind? Um, Even so, the present day is arguably the golden age of psychiatry when one takes into consideration the vast amounts of wealth that the psychopharmaceutical industrial complex aggressively siphons from the pockets of its victims. Burns identifies Descartes as one of the central expositors of the mind-brain question that is unavoidable in psychiatry. He also addresses the nature versus nurture debate, but the most telling portion of Burns' booklet is his description of the anti-psychiatry movement. Quote, the anti-psychiatry message was that psychiatry did not so much need improving as scrapping. At its best, psychiatry, was confused and confusing, and at its worst, a truly evil instrument of oppression masquerading as a benign medical practice. Unquote. Burns then introduces three prominent authors that came to personify the anti-psychiatry movement, namely Thomas Szasz, Michel Foucault, and R.D. Laing. There's also a section devoted to Irving Goffman in the previous chapter. Burns' presentation of each of these authors' arguments is superficial and dismissive, and his portrayal of psychiatric survivors is equally deplorable. Quote, many, though by no means all, ex-patient groups have become militantly anti-psychiatric, often referring to themselves as survivors rather than patients, clients, or service users. Overall, however, there is now much less concerted opposition to psychiatry as a discipline. No. Just as he dismisses the anti-psychiatry movement and the voices of psychiatric survivors, Burns brushes over abusive psychiatric practices. By downplaying the severity and the barbarity of these abuses, Burns attempts to show, on the whole, psychiatry does more good than harm. Quote, so while we focus in this chapter on what psychiatry can get wrong, let's not forget that it more often gets right, and that progress has been substantial. This is a shamefaced lie. Burns concludes with a chapter about psychiatry in the 21st century. He presumes that advances in technology, neuroscience, genetics, and medicine hold the key to preserving the practice from further crises. The cutting edge of psychiatry is now found in theories of early identification. These theories have given rise to a foolish project for seeking to treat people who supposedly exhibit a high risk of developing a so-called mental illness. The scope of psychiatry is ever expanding, and its methods are becoming ever more ruthless, so watch out. No one is exempt from the sweeping generalizations of early identification. After all, why drug only those who have already been labeled as mentally ill when one can expand the diagnostic categories to include every living thing, past, present, and future? Now, as I was reading that, I thought of the movie, if you've ever seen Minority Report, I believe it's a Tom Cruise movie, where basically there's an attempt to convict people of crimes that they haven't even committed. It's exactly what psychiatry is trying to do. It's trying to label as mentally ill in advance people they think that are mentally ill. In summary, Tom Burns' Psychiatry, a very short introduction, is as conflicted and contradictory as psychiatry itself. His vain attempts to bolster an industry that inflicts unspeakable harm upon untold millions of people is more than reprehensible. Like psychiatry itself, it is sick. So that's a little introduction to Tom Burns' Psychiatry, a very short introduction. And the next book I'd like to share with you is American Psychosis by E. Fuller Torrey, How the Federal Government Destroyed the Mental Illness Treatment System. So this is another apologetic work, or work defending or promoting psychiatry. And this, even more than the last two books, Edward Shorter's book and Tom Burns' book, E. Fuller Torrey this is probably worse than both of them combined, even though those first two were pretty bad. So my review or introduction to this book is in my blog. It's called The Psychosis of American Psychosis. In the preface to his book, American Psychosis, psychiatrist and member of the National Institute of Mental Health, E. Fuller Torrey, provides a key to understanding his work. Quote, "I don't know why other people write books, but for me it is a selfish enterprise. I write to answer questions that are bothering me." Unquote. Ostensibly, the questions that bothered Torrey enough to induce him to write an entire book had to do with the, quote, "unfolding disaster of services for people with serious mental illnesses," one of which his sister, who was diagnosed with schizophrenia, was deemed to be one. These are questions to which Torrey also claims to have the correct answers. So interestingly, Torrey has a sister who is diagnosed with schizophrenia. We've talked about how schizophrenia is a fake disease and it's the sacred symbol of psychiatry. And Burns also had a relative, I believe his mother, who had some contact with psychiatry. Edward Shorter, I'm not sure about, but the other books I like to share also are connected. Actually, the other books I'd like to share are directly connected. In other words, authors who themselves have been on the receiving end of psychiatric abuse. So these are authors. The first authors I'm sharing are authors who are on the giving end of psychiatric abuse. But unfortunately, there are even authors who have been on the receiving end who are still promoting psychiatry. For many years, Torrey has been at the forefront of promoting a biological approach to mental illness, confessing that his family experiences have shaped his perspectives profoundly. Quote, "Schizophrenia is a terrible disease to have, as bad as any disease we know of, and it's a huge burden to bear for families. To have on top of that the burden of being told you caused it is almost unbearable." Torrey is right to be appalled by the history and the current state of the mental health industry, and his propensity to view mental illness through the lens of his family experiences is both understandable and forgivable. His misgivings concerning the effects of Freudian psychology and the government bureaucracies are also justifiable. Nevertheless, Torrey's book, American Psychosis, is rife with glaring contradictions and subtle half-truths. In spite of his circular reasoning and a variety of other logical fallacies, Torrey attempts to persuade his audience that, quote, "the federal government destroyed the mental illness treatment system," and that his book is a, quote, "rallying cry for the necessity of establishing better psychiatric care for our nation's most vulnerable." So here we have another mental health monger who's basically, claiming to fix this broken system, which, as we've shown, is not a broken system. It's a corrupt system, and it cannot be fixed. It can only be, or it ought only to be, abolished. Ironically, in writing this book, Torrey has been endeavoring to perpetuate the very system of which he himself is so critical. Even more ironically, Torrey verges on repeating history while simultaneously admonishing his readers to learn lessons from the past. He argues that the medical health industry, the mental health industry is a disaster, but his proposals to fix the system would prove to be even more disastrous. His vision for correcting the errors that produce the current predicament of the mental health industry in the United States is fundamentally flawed because it fails to take into consideration the underlying causes of those errors. Ultimately, Torrey's book, American Psychosis, is a manifestation of the very symptoms that it claims to diagnose, and it is a cause of the disease that it allegedly sets out to cure. Torrey begins his diagnosis of American psychosis with a story of Joe Kennedy's decision to seek a lobotomy for his daughter Rosemary, a decision which Torrey correctly describes as an unmitigated disaster. So at least he gets this right. The Kennedys, Rosemary, received horrible treatment from psychiatry, and this is Thomas Saz has recorded about that, and it's good that at least Torrey recognizes that it was an unmitigated disaster, destroyed Rosemary Kennedy's life. He then traces the history of the federal government's growing involvement in the field of psychiatry, including the establishment of the National Neuropsychiatric Institute in 1945, which later became the National Institute of Mental Health, or NIM. Remember the secret of NIM. Torrey describes the ambitions of NIM directors Robert Felix, Stanley F. Yolis, and his own mentor, Bertram S. Brown, each of whom labored vigorously under the delusion that they were making history by participating in the creation of a brave new world. For example, Torrey records Robert Felix's affinity for beliefs such as those adhered to by C. Brock Chisholm of the World Health Organization. We have never had a really peaceful society, quote, we have never had a really peaceful society in the world. Can the world learn to live at peace? With the other human sciences, psychiatry must now decide what is to be the immediate future of the human race. No one else can, and this is the prime responsibility of psychiatry. That's a real quote. Such grandiosity flows from the kind of thinking that is catalytic to the confluence of government and psychiatry, or what Thomas Saz referred to as the therapeutic state. Torrey claims to oppose this merging, at least on the federal level, but as a psychiatrist, whether wittingly or not, he performs and promotes the rites and rituals of the ersatz religion known as psychiatry. One of the major components of pseudoscientific, pseudo-religious psychiatry is the production and distribution of its pseudo-sacramental psychotropic drugs. While dogma and denominations may vary, pharmaceutical high priests and pastors of psychiatry far and wide push toxins as treatment and poisons as panacea. As Torrey himself preaches, quote, one of the great ironies of American psychiatric history is that during 1955, at the same time that the Joint Commission on Mental Illness and Health was being charged with finding a solution to the mental illness crisis, a totally unexpected solution was appearing. The solution was chlorpromazine, sold in the United States under the trade name Thorazine. It had been discovered in France in 1952 and reported to dramatically reduce the delusions, hallucinations, and manic symptoms of many patients with severe psychiatric disorders, unquote. Touting Thorazine as a solution to anything is tantamount to calling cocaine candy. It is simply untrue that Thorazine or any other psychotropic drug is a solution, let alone a medication. In fact, psychotropic drugs are more often than not the real culprits in inflicting brain damage and fomenting psychosis. On the surface, these drugs may appear to work by sedating or numbing patients, but in reality, they are only working a gradual chemical reconstruction of the brain, the effects of which range from severe mental, emotional, and physical agony to psychosis, suicide, and murder. Torrey decries deinstitutionalization, or the emptying of the state mental hospitals, while lambasting those who were involved in the creation of a federal mental health program, particularly the political figures whom he considers to be ignorant concerning the problem of mental illness. Torrey also misinterprets and ridicules the ideas of others whom he has marked as complicit in the process of deinstitutionalization, authors such as Thomas Saz, Irving Goffman, and Ken Kesey. So Saz obviously wrote The Myth of Mental Illness. Goffman wrote a book called Asylums. Ken Kesey is the author of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Torrey even goes so far as to conclude, as the title of his book suggests, that the United States as a whole was suffering from a form of psychosis. Quote, one might have been excused for thinking that the nation itself needed psychiatric help. Unquote. Torrey's predilection for diagnosing diseases and prescribing cures, even for an entire nation, is just a minute example of the psychiatric hegemony that produces books such as American Psychosis or the spurious Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM-5. So again, we see the psychiatric obsession with labeling and diagnosing anything in sight, even America. So here's E. Fuller Torrey claiming that America is psychotic, and somehow he, as the psychiatrist, has the solution to cure this American psychosis. In addition to endorsing drugs and denouncing deinstitutionalization, Torrey has also filled the pages of his book, American Psychosis, with a plethora of beguiling euphemisms. Torrey's allusions to psychiatric services, treatment, and care are at best ambiguous and at worst duplicitous. Such terminology disguises the unpleasant realities of psychiatry, where services may mean electroshock, treatment may mean forced drugging, and care may mean involuntary solitary confinement. When Torrey writes about psychiatric assistance or meeting the needs of patients, what he's actually referring to is the tyrannizing and subjugation of suffering souls. As further illustration of Torrey's complete disregard for the great harm that is caused by psychiatry in general and psychotropic drugging in particular, consider the following passage. Quote, from the late 1960s onward, the exodus of state hospital patients was on autopilot, driven by the availability of antipsychotic drugs, which got the patients well enough to be discharged. The availability of federal Medicaid and Medicare funds, which effectively saved state funds, and court rulings, which encouraged patient discharge. Unquote. Realistically speaking, there is no such thing as an antipsychotic drug. These noxious chemical compounds would more appropriately be called psychotics, because they actually induce psychosis rather than prevent it. And since I've written this, I wrote this a long time ago, I've come to even, the term psychosis in itself is problematic, because that ties back to all the Freudian gobbledygook from which psychiatry grew. Patients who are forcibly administered psychotropic or brain-altering drugs do not become well enough to be discharged. Instead, they are reduced to a zombie-like state by means of a veritable chemical lobotomy and a synthetic straitjacket. Even small amounts, the slightest adjustments to dosages, or rapid withdrawal from these harmful psychotropic drugs greatly increases the likelihood that the patient victim will exhibit psychotic symptoms. And I have a note here, see Medication Madness. So we talked about Peter Bregan's book, Medication Madness. Furthermore, Torrey contends, quote, in 1963, when the Community Mental Health Centers Act had been signed, there had been a coherent, if flawed, mental illness treatment system, which had been run by the states for over a century. It consisted of state hospitals that were in poor shape, but slowly improving, thanks to the availability of new medications. Again, there is absolutely no evidence to suggest that any new medications produce a positive curative effect for patients who have been diagnosed as mentally ill during this time, nor that state mental hospitals were slowly improving. In fact, the opposite is true. An accurate history of psychiatry records that the numbers of the nation's so-called mentally ill actually began to rise in proportion to the availability and distribution of psychotropic drugs. And my note is to see Robert Whitaker's Mad in America and Anatomy of an Epidemic. Torrey completely neglects the overwhelming evidence that psychotropic drugs inflict immense irreversible harm by arguing in favor of their effectiveness. Quote, given the effectiveness of medications that has become available to treat serious psychiatric disorders starting in the 1950s, discharging hundreds of thousands of mentally ill individuals from state mental hospitals with both was both logical and humane. Thus, deinstitutionalization per se was not the mistake. The mistake, rather, was our failure to provide continuing treatment and rehabilitation for these individuals once they left the hospitals, unquote. While it is certainly true that families and communities play an essential role in fostering healing for the sick and afflicted, the only reason that psychotropic drugs may in any way be termed effective is that they effectively damage the brains and crush the minds of those who are unfortunate enough to ingest them. As if that were not enough, and I should also say, or to be injected with them, because not all people voluntarily consume these dangerous chemicals. As if it weren't enough, Torrey continues his crusade against those who are labeled as mentally ill by blaming individuals who resist drugging for their lack of awareness of their own illness. Thomas Saz has talked about this in many places, or their need to take medication. There is even a fancy pseudoscientific word to describe the condition, anosognosia. Victims of Alzheimer's disease or stroke may manifest real anosognosia, but a person who resists involuntary hospitalization and forced drugging is anything but anosognosiatic. In fact, the opposite is true. Psychiatrists who perpetuate such abuses suffer from a more severe type of anosognosia, in other words, a lack of awareness of the harm that they cause, the harm that they inflict. But Torrey doesn't stop there. He has the temerity to pit his own campaign for augmenting the authority of psychiatry against the testimonies of those fortunate few who have endured and overcome its abuses. Quote, unfortunately, Torrey brazenly declares, both the employment of mentally ill individuals as peer counselors and the recovery movement have been partially discredited by the parallel psychiatric survivor movement. This consists of a small but vocal group of individuals who have more or less recovered from their previous mental illness and who profess four beliefs, although of course not every survivor agrees with all four. 1. Psychiatric medications are extremely dangerous and best not taken at all. 2. No mentally ill person should ever be treated involuntarily. 3. Electroconvulsive therapy, ECT, should never be used. And 4. Serious psychiatric disorders are not physiological brain disorders, but rather merely states of emotional distress. The survivors had their philosophical origins, and this is still Torrey writing, had their philosophical origin in their own experience of having been mentally ill, as well as in the writings of Thomas Saz, The Myth of Mental Illness, and R.D. Laing. A few were also influenced by the anti-psychiatry teachings of Scientology, and there's the bugaboo of Scientology again. They have organized themselves over the years into groups such as the Insane Liberation Front, the Network Against Psychiatric Assault, and the National Association of Psychiatric Survivors. By claiming to speak for all psychiatric consumers, they have discredited the others, especially regarding the issue of involuntary treatment, which is an essential treatment strategy needed for a small number of mentally ill individuals. By claiming that mental illness does not exist or is merely an alternate reality, this group has also discredited the recovery movement. Okay, and I'll show why all of that is just bogus. In the first place, the psychiatric survivor movement that Torrey pretends to describe does nothing to discredit anything but psychiatry and the pharmaceutical industry itself. Secondly, the real psychiatric survivor movement is, sadly, not small at all. There are thousands upon thousands of survivors, and as a result of pervasive pharmaceutical fraud and psychiatric abuse, the numbers are rapidly rising. Torrey claims that the psychiatric movement is not only small, but vocal. In reality, psychiatry and the pharmaceutical industry are obstreperously vocal, garnering overwhelming support from government bureaucracies and the media, while the voices of psychiatric survivors are rarely given an audience. If anything, psychiatric survivors need to be more vocal in order to be heard above the deafening drumbeat of psychiatric propaganda that pounds incessantly into the global consciousness. Torrey professes that the psychiatric survivors movement consists of individuals who have recovered more or less from their previous mental illness. But in truth, psychiatric survivors were never mentally ill in the first place. In fact, much of what is regarded as mental illness is iatrogenic in nature, meaning that it's caused by medical examination or treatment. Regardless of whether or not an individual manifests symptoms that could be diagnosed as mental illness, psychotropic drugs nearly always cause legitimate illnesses in both the brain and the body. This is not to say that there are not many people who suffer from a variety of non-iatrogenic mental or emotional afflictions, but that psychotropic drugs can easily turn a very healthy individual into a very sick one. Moreover, the label of mental illness does nothing to promote the health of the individual in question. More often, it creates a stigma so crippling that it is almost impossible to abolish. Torrey also attempts to discredit the psychiatric survivor movement by mischaracterizing the principles that undergird it. The 4 beliefs that he outlines are deceptively phrased so as to make the ideas sound silly. The first belief, one, that psychiatric medications are extremely dangerous and best not taken at all, would better be worded, 1. Psychotropic drugs are extremely toxic and have severe iatrogenic properties. These drugs are not in any way medication and are certainly not psychiatric medication. Does this mean that psychotropic brain-altering drugs are dangerous? Only if they are purchased and consumed. Does this mean that they shouldn't be taken at all? Yes, unless one doesn't mind causing severe damage to the infinitely complex and delicate organ called the brain. The second belief, that, quote, no mentally ill person should ever be treated involuntarily, belies the fact that so-called diagnoses of mental illness are often arbitrarily, I would say always, since there's no such thing, and that though administered, and that those who are unfortunate enough to receive such a diagnosis are seldom treated in any way that could be called worthy of the word care. By inserting the word ever, Torrey attempts to argue that psychiatric survivors are culpable for exacerbating the extreme cases in which a supposedly dangerous person, whether mentally ill or not, may need to be subdued by force. This is a lie. The third belief, that, quote, electroconvulsive therapy, ECT, should never be used, is equally misleading because there is nothing therapeutic about shocking a person's brain with strong electrical currents. And if I do a video about the history of psychiatry and how electroshock was invented, I may have talked about it already, but even the man who invented it, I believe was an Italian man, I think it was Cerletti, even this man realized when he was shocking the brain of his first victim, he realized that it was really awful and dangerous. And the victim said, you know, stop, you're killing me. And yet now this is, you know, it's called therapy now. And people, you know, are still, in some places, still believe that it's actual therapy. So unlike the use of the word ever in the previous belief, the word never in this statement is more appropriate since electroshock has been proven to be a barbaric, brain-disabling practice in psychiatry. See Dr. Bregan's Brain Disabling Treatments in Psychiatry. And also Bonnie Burstow wrote a whole novel, I'm forgetting the name of it right now, but Mrs. something, a whole novel based on electroshock torture. Finally, the fourth belief that, quote, 4 serious psychiatric disorders are not physiological brain disorders, but rather merely states of emotional distress, unquote, is the most fraudulently phrased of them all. Torrey attempts to perpetuate a hypothesis that was disproved long ago, that symptoms of mental and emotional suffering that are classified under the rubric of mental illness or serious psychiatric disorders have observable biological causes or measurable genetic links. In truth, there is no scientific evidence to show any mental illness is caused by a chemical imbalance in the brain or by other any other physiological aberration. See, for example, Irving Kirsch's The Emperor's New Drugs. There is, however, much evidence to support the fact that symptoms that typically incur a diagnosis of mental illness often arise from emotional or environmental stress. See, for example, Dr. Peter Bregan's Toxic Psychiatry. The history of modern psychiatry is riddled with failed attempts to pinpoint biological causes for mental and emotional suffering. Ironically, this witch hunt for a biological cause, and it's a real witch hunt as we've mentioned in the previous video on the Manufacture of Madness, Thomas Szasz, comparing the Inquisition to the mental health movement, or the mental health movement to the Inquisition. Ironically, this witch hunt for a biological cause began with Freudian psychology and continues to this day, carried out even by those who claim to reject Freud's earlier premises and conclusions. By using the word merely in this fourth belief, Torrey attempts to show that psychiatric survivors are indifferent to or originators of the suffering of those who are labeled as mentally ill. Nothing could be further from the truth. For Torrey to claim that survivors had their philosophical origin in their own experience of having been mentally ill is disingenuous at best, since psychiatric survivors were never mentally ill in the first place. Furthermore, to claim that psychiatric survivors had their philosophical origin in the writings of Thomas Szasz and R.D. Laing is only partially true, since many psychiatric survivors have never even heard of these authors. In fact, most psychiatric survivors only find out about these authors long after they have been psychiatrically abused. In fact, those who have had the good fortune to encounter the writings of these authors beforehand are in some ways immunized against the psychiatric assault. They are prepared to never become victims of psychiatry in the first place. And that's one reason why I want to make these videos and present this information, so that people have the correct information ahead of time, so they won't be sucked into the trap of psychiatry, or they won't be grabbed by its awful tentacles. But the most absurd of Torrey's teachings is that some psychiatric survivors have been influenced by Scientology. The reason why this claim is so absurd is that there would be no need for Scientological opposition to psychiatry, and a psychiatric survivor movement would not exist if psychiatry didn't actually inflict serious harm on individuals and families and communities. Think of it. What other medical profession or supposed medical profession has an entire movement against it? I mean, I don't see, a movement against the treatment for diabetes, or a movement against, I don't know. Well, there are some. I guess there would be some other barbaric medical practices, but psychiatry is unique in having such a distinct movement of opposition to it. In other words, the teachings of Scientology don't influence psychiatric survivors. Rather, Scientological opposition to psychiatry coincides at certain points with the opposition to psychiatry that comes naturally to survivors who have endured psychiatric abuse. If psychiatry were actually a real science and a healing art, anti-psychiatry and the psychiatric survivors movement would not exist. Torrey has the audacity to assume that those who are subjected to the horrors of psychiatry should be called consumers of psychiatry. He has the chutzpah to assume that involuntary treatment is an essential treatment strategy needed for a small number of mentally ill individuals. He even dares to claim that psychiatric survivors who have been subjected to psychiatric torture are guilty of discrediting the recovery movement. This is a bald-faced lie. If anyone knows anything about suffering and has compassion upon those who are diagnosed or misdiagnosed as mentally ill, it is a psychiatric survivor. Luckily, a handful of honest psychiatrists have seen through the lies inherent in their profession and have begun to push back against coercive psychiatry. Speaking of Thomas Szasz, speaking of Peter Breggin, and a small number of others. Luckily, nevertheless, there is yet too many psychiatrists like Torrey who plan to perpetuate processes of pain while posturing preposterously as promoters of compassion. Wow, I really got off on a alliterative sentence there. I somehow plan to perpetuate the processes of pain while posturing preposterously as promoters of compassion. Torrey brings his book to a close by compiling lists of the names of violent individuals that had been diagnosed with mental illness. He assembles these lists in order to support his flimsy thesis that more of the nation's mentally ill need to be forcibly restrained and subjected to psychiatric treatment, which is actually torture. Sadly, Torrey fails to mention that in many of these extreme cases, the violent individuals were actually driven to madness by drugs. See medication madness. He also conveniently fails to mention that perpetrators of violent offenses sometimes fall back on the plea of insanity as a justification for their crimes. And again, Thomas Szasz has written all about the the insanity defense and why that's such a bogus concept. Ironically, as Torrey criticizes his predecessors for their grandiose schemes to prevent or cure elusive mental illness, he fails to consider that his own schemes are equally grandiose, if not more so. As he laments the unfolding disaster of services for people with serious mental illness, he fails to recognize the disaster that so-called services have always been and always will be unless they are eliminated. See Mad in America. By writing American Psychosis, Torrey is on the verge of repeating the same history that he so adamantly warns others not to repeat. He even approvingly cites Aldous Huxley, quote, that men do not learn very much from the lessons of history is the most important of all the lessons that history has to teach. The federal government did not destroy the mental illness treatment system, nor is Torrey's book a rallying cry for the necessity of establishing better psychiatric care for our nation's most vulnerable. Long ago, psychiatry abolished the only successful system for caring for the so-called mentally ill or emotionally afflicted that had been established by the Quakers. And that's Mad in America. Robert Whitaker has a chapter discussing the Quakers. The only rallying cry that can be read in Torrey's book is that which seeks to promote psychiatry itself at the expense of our nation's most vulnerable. Torrey dedicates the final sections of his book, American Psychosis, to listing what he considers to be 8 impediments to change and the solutions he derives from at least 10 lessons to be learned from history. Torrey maintains that, quote, if we hope to change mental health policies, we must first understand the forces that impede change, unquote. According to Torrey, these forces include, quote, 1, the lack of understanding of serious mental illness, 2, the lack of understanding of the magnitude of the mental illness problem, 3, lack of understanding of the civil rights of people with severe mental illnesses, 4, public mistrust of psychiatry, 5, economic interests to maintain the status quo, 6, political interests to maintain the status quo, 7, the federal government, 8, lack of leadership. In presenting these so-called impediments to change, Torrey is actually creating further impediments to the real changes that need to take place. Once again, he attempts to lay the blame on the shoulders of the very people who have been severely harmed by merciless psychiatric interventions. Quote, the history of psychiatry includes multiple examples of gross abuse, including the killing of mental patients in Nazi Germany, the forced psychiatric hospitalization of political dissidents in the Soviet Union, and the unconsented sterilization of patients in psychiatric hospitals under the eugenics movement in the United States. Groups opposed to psychiatry, such as the Scientologists and the psychiatric survivors, described in the last chapter, exploit this public mistrust to block any legislation associated with involuntary treatment, unquote. And my response, truthfully, there would be no public mistrust of psychiatry if indeed psychiatry were not guilty of the aforementioned atrocities, or if those atrocities had ended. The sorry fact of the matter is that as bad as the psychiatric abuses of Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union, and the eugenics movement were, similar abuses, or even worse abuses, continue to this very day behind the facade of psychiatric services, treatment, and care. After listing the impediments to change, Torrey poses the question, what should we do? The many impediments to change are the bad news, Torrey writes. However, the fact that we know what to do to correct the existing mental health disaster is the good news. This is where Torrey situates himself, perhaps unintentionally, in the same tradition of which he is so critical, namely the tradition of his NIM predecessors Robert Felix, Stanley F. Yolis, and Bertram S. Brown. Torrey continues, there is a surprisingly broad consensus on what good services should look like, although there is less agreement on how they should be organized and funded. In truth, the only broad consensus is that which is found within the echo chamber of psychiatry itself, and the institutions that sustain it, big pharma, big government, NIM, and so forth. Good services and broad consensus are psychiatric buzzwords, which when translated into the common speech of the average citizen or victim of psychiatry would be torture and tyranny. Torrey impudently claims that opposition to psychiatric coercion, oppression, is simply illogical. Quote, logical thinking, however, is not the guiding principle of America's mental health system. So we allow mentally ill individuals who are unaware of their illness to live on the streets or in jails rather than treating them, all in the name of protecting their civil rights. As our treatment system has developed over the last half century, callousness apparently became confused with civil rights. The freedom to be insane is a cruel hoax perpetrated on those who cannot think clearly by those who will not think clearly. Unquote. In actuality, psychiatry itself is the cruel hoax perpetrated on those who could think clearly if only their brains were not poisoned by toxic pharmaceutical agents, nor their minds clouded by psychiatric deceit. The cruel hoax of psychiatry is perpetrated on innocent victims by those who claim to think so clearly as to merit full ideological and physical dominion over their fellow human beings. In summary, E. Fuller Torrey's book, American Psychosis, is just as disastrous as the system that it criticizes. Torrey's teachings are as detrimental to the nation's mental health as psychotropic drugs. Indeed, American Psychosis is a manifestation of the very symptoms that it claims to diagnose. If read too widely and too uncritically, it could also become a cause of the disease that allegedly sets out to cure. While I have systematically dismantled Torrey's false arguments and exposed the calumny in his writing, I do not wish to ignore the suffering that his sister, as well as many others, has had to endure. Nor do I wish to ignore the suffering that he and his family have had to endure with something so puzzling as so-called schizophrenia. I readily acknowledge the fact that there are many people who suffer from crippling afflictions and that such afflictions exact a terrible toll on individuals and families. Everyone, especially such individuals and families, deserves increased amounts of compassion, love, and kindness. May we each do our part to ease the suffering of those around us. So that's my criticism, review, excoriation of American Psychosis. Unfortunately, I'm not the only one who's been criticizing this psychiatric propaganda or these apologists of psychiatry. I mentioned before there's a man named Dr. Philip Hickey, who he writes frequently for Mad in America, Robert Whitaker's website. And not too long ago, Dr. Hickey has written an article in reply to Dr. Pease, P-I-E-S. Dr. Pease is another person like E. Fuller Torrey, Burns, and Edward Shorter, another apologist for psychiatry, and Dr. Pease or Pies, I don't know how you say his name, has not too long ago started to promote the chemical imbalance hoax again, and fortunately Dr. Hickey has written to debunk that. I'll just remind you of Dr. Hickey wrote a wonderful article in defense of anti-psychiatry, and his concluding statement bears repeating. Quote, psychiatry is not something good that needs minor adjustments. Rather, it is something fundamentally flawed and rotten, based on spurious premises and devoid of even a semblance of critical self-scrutiny. It is utterly and totally irremediable. It has locked itself in the falsehood that every problem is an illness, and for every illness there is a drug from which it cannot extricate itself. It is nothing more than legalized drug pushing, endlessly attempting to mask its guilt by proclaiming its innocence, vilifying its critics, and calling for more treatment. It has built into itself the seeds of its own destruction and will eventually fade away as its credibility dwindles and more potential recruits recognize the sordid reality and seek careers in genuine ethically driven medicine. And I hope that Dr. Hickey is right about that, and that the disintegration of psychiatry will happen on its own. But I suspect that it will take a little more resistance than that, and to abolish psychiatry may take longer than most of the people who are abolitionists would hope for. So those are some books, reviews of books that promote psychiatry and that are apologetic or defenses of psychiatry. There are many others. Just want to pull out a few more. So sometimes you'll find books. They're everywhere, and this is the problem that most of the books that people find, if they're looking for information about psychiatry or so-called mental illness, they're usually going to find books like this. Bipolar Disorder, 5 Steps to a More Peaceful Life, includes, the Dynamic 5-Step Workbook, Take Charge of Bipolar Disorder, 4-Step Plan for you and your loved ones to manage the illness and create lasting stability. So, you're going to find lots of books like that claiming to give you a way to deal with these so-called illnesses. But they're all based on the false assumptions of psychiatry itself. Sadly enough, there are even survivors of psychiatry who continue to promote psychiatry without knowing it, or in other words, people who have undergone psychiatric abuse who nevertheless write in promotion of psychiatry as if psychiatry had actually helped them. One of those is a lady named Kay Redfield Jamison. She's written a book called The Unquiet Mind. She's written Touched with Fire. And she actually came to Brigham Young University recently and spoke. She is one who was diagnosed as bipolar or some other maybe major depression, bipolar. She was drugged, given lithium and all sorts of drugs, and and continues to. But she's also a psychiatrist, so she continues to promote psychiatry, and her writings and her speeches are all in favor of psychiatry, even though she herself has endured the abuses of psychiatry. And you wonder how such a thing is possible. How could it be possible that, when someone has received such brain-damaging treatments and has been, labeled as mentally ill, and you see this a lot with celebrities too. They're given a bipolar diagnosis. Who did I mention? Carrie Fisher. They're constantly promoting psychiatry and the mental illness, the myth of mental illness. They become a sort of advertisement for psychiatry, even though they themselves have been so awfully harmed by it. And that's mainly because they don't know the history of psychiatry, or they don't understand it, or they are willfully ignorant of it. Another sad case is this book, A Promise of Hope, The Astonishing True Story of a Woman Afflicted with Bipolar Disorder and the Miraculous Treatment That Cured Her, by Autumn Stringham. And it receives, praise from Charles Popper, MD, Harvard Medical School. So here we have another book where this poor girl and her family have all been abused by psychiatry and drugged and labeled as mentally ill, and they all basically buy into these labels and then end up unwittingly promoting the very system that has destroyed their lives. So those are a couple of books by survivors of psychiatry who nevertheless continue to promote psychiatry, probably because they don't know any better. So I think that should do. I do want to conclude this video to remind you that if no one should ever withdraw from a psychotropic drug rapidly or cold turkey. If you feel that you would like to or if someone you know would like to stop taking psychotropic drugs, antidepressants, so-called antipsychotics, it should always be done gradually, and it's very painful, and it's a very long process. Um, there are resources to help people in that process. I've mentioned before, Peter Breggin has a book called Psychiatric Drug Withdrawal, a guide for prescribers, therapists, patients, and their families. There's a book, How to Get Off of Psychoactive Drugs Safely. I've mentioned Laura Delano has a project called the Inner Compass Initiative and the Withdrawal Project, and she helps psychiatric survivors to withdraw from psychotropic drugs. There's also an organization called Mind Freedom, which is to a grassroots human rights organization to help psychiatric survivors. But even that, I think, even a lot of these organizations, they still, even though they're helping people to extricate themselves from the web of psychiatry, they're often still complicit because they buy into the false notions of mental illness and the variety of labels that are listed in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. So those are some resources: Mind Freedom, Inner Compass Initiative, How to Get Off of Psychoactive Drugs Safely, Psychiatric Drug Withdrawal by Peter Breggin. Those are some recommended sources if you know someone or you yourself are looking to withdraw from psychotropic drugs. So this has been episode 16, and it's about how the sickness of psychiatry, or psychiatry is sick. And I will see you next time.